Welcome once again to Captain Fred's Aviation Theater. Today we're visiting at Tehachapi, California, and this is Jeff Bayard, who is our guest. He's the owner of this beautiful primary glider. Jeff, I want to start right off. Tell our viewers what a primary glider is and how it flies.
Well, primary glider was developed back in 1920 by Alexander Lippisch, and it was to train students to fly, beginning students to fly gliders and sailplanes. This one is a 1950 Slingsby Type 38 Grasshopper. It was built for the Royal Air Force, the Air Cadets program, after World War II. It flies just like any other airplane, although it's very crude. It doesn't have any differential in the ailerons.
Primitive. We don't use the word crude. Primitive.
Okay, very primitive then. It has no differential in the ailerons, and again, just very simple controls and very straightforward. It was built for 12-year-old kids and older to fly.
Now, the wings are covered, and the empennage is covered, and nothing else is covered. Is that right?
That's correct. It's just got an open frame fuselage, just a barn door gate fuselage. Wings and tail are basically, these are off a Slingsby Cadet. They surplused all those and they built new wings, high-performance wings for them, and that's where these particular wings came from. This was developed from the 1920 Lippisch Zergling glider, which later developed into the SG-38 school glider, and this is the last development of that. Again, this is probably the last manufactured primary glider.
You used the word Slingsby. Is that the name of the man who built it?
Yes, it was Fred Slingsby. He was a sailplane manufacturer in England, started manufacturing sailplanes in the early 1930s, maybe even 1929 or so. And he stayed manufacturing sailplanes up through the mid-1970s. The company is still in business. They're making submarines now at this time. Completely different from the original company that Fred Slingsby started.
Now, I assume that he copied the Germans because they perfected the primary glider in the early 20s.
Yes, the first sailplane Fred Slingsby manufactured was a Lippisch, Stammer Lippisch Zergling, which was a variation of the original 1920 Zergling Lippisch design. The plans were actually sold into the United States from Germany. Here in this country, the Soaring Society of America translated them into English and also transferred all the units from metric into English units. Somehow those plans made it back into England and were manufactured by Slingsby. So it's from Germany through the United States into England where the first Stammer Lippisch Zergling came about.
Would you tell our viewers why the primary glider was so big and so important in Germany after World War I?
Well, after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles forbid the Germans to build any power-driven aircraft. And as a result, there was no restriction on building gliders. And so for the Flugsport magazine over in Germany, Oskar Uranus, he started a soaring contest or glider contest at the Wasserkuppe in 1920, and from there on the gliders developed on from then. The primary gliders were just a simple, quick way to get the German people back into the air after the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles.
And I want to mention that Hermann Göring started glider clubs all over Germany, and that they used what they called shock card, what we would call bungee cord, launching on hillsides. And it was very common for them to spend their whole weekend flying gliders.
Right. The bungee launch was actually originated in 1920 by
somebody.
Yeah, think of his name. Anyway, it was on the Blue Mouse glider, the Black Devil and the Blue Mouse. Wolfgang Klemperer was the originator of the shock cord launch, and they started doing that in 1920. It's very uncommon now. There's still a few places in Germany and in England where they do it. I don't know of anybody in the U.S. that's doing shock cord launches anymore. Hermann Göring didn't get involved with the soaring until later in the 30s when the Hitler Youth got going, when Hitler became into power. The primary type glider was well popular before even Göring became involved in the glider program.
My glider instructor was Hauptmann Hans Busch, who was an ace in the Luftwaffe, and he learned to fly in a primary glider, and he was trained by Hermann Göring, so he was in one of Göring's clubs.
So it was in the mid to late 30s.
After the gliders, Hitler went to the League of Nations and said, look, everybody's got airplanes except Germany. I know we can't have an air force, but couldn't we at least have air mail? So the League of Nations says, yeah, you can have airmail. So he says, okay, we're going to build some high-speed airmail planes. And so they built the ME-109, a high-speed airmail plane. And the Luftwaffe pilots went from gliders into ME-109s. But they were all experienced glider pilots.
By the time they went to the power, and actually some of the training was actually done in Russia to get around the League of Nations at the time.
I didn't know that.
So there was a lot of pilot training. So a lot of the Luftwaffe pilots were actually trained in Russia in the Falkland
Because at
biplanes.
that time, Russia and Germany were allies.
Right.
They were allies up until the time that Hitler invaded Poland.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's talk about this particular glider. People who've seen our program before know that I learned to fly in a primary originally. The one that I built when I was 14 was covered with JCPenney drapery lining, and it didn't have pedals. It just had a baseball bat, a modified baseball bat across the front, and it was a rudder bar that you push back and forth. And it wasn't as fancy as this one. Mine was even more primitive than this. But let's start at the tip of the nose here and tell our viewers about all the different aspects of this primary glider. Here on the nose, is this a launch card?
Right. This is for the auto tow release or a winch tow release, or it could even be aero tow. This airplane in England was certified for aero tow. It was spin tested. This is called an Otford link. It was made by the Otford Motor Car Company. Down underneath here is another hook, and this is for the bungee launch. So these were bungee launched in the military academies from the Royal Air Force.
Is this strong enough to take an aero tow?
Yes, in fact, one of these was actually towed across the English Channel. It was also towed up to 10,000 feet for the spin test by Derek Piggott, and he also is the one that flew it across the Channel on a dare. And so it is, they towed them with tiger moths, and it was common back in the 50s and early 60s to aero tow these.
Here you do
Strictly auto
automobile
tows, yes,
Okay. How high can you get on an automobile tow?
With the line we have, we can get almost to 1,000 feet, 900 feet roughly, maybe 1,000 on a good day.
Now, we were at Lake Elsinore a while back, and they towed a 233 with a pickup truck, and they just stopped, and it flew like a kite on the end of the rope.
Right.
Would this do the same thing?
If we have a good positive wind gradient, we can do that here. It's not common, but we have done it, and it just takes a good positive wind gradient with altitude.
Okay, moving back here, instead of a rudder bar, you have pedals.
We have pedals, and it's also a parallelogram. You notice the two tubes here, and it keeps the pedals flat with each other.
It's like bending a shoebox.
Right. It actually keeps the pedals even, so you're not pushing around like this. The pedals stay straight
At the same,
by doing that.
It's like mashing a rectangle.
Yes,
You know the story about Orville Wright, that he was standing holding a shoebox, and he says, you know, we have to find some way to control that airplane.
Right.
And he was nervously twisting the shoebox, and he looked down and he says, that's it. And they came up with warping the wing by his twisting the shoebox. But you've got the same thing here. It keeps everything
It just keeps everything parallel, right. It's just
Okay, then you've got your pulleys and your cables.
Right.
And you've got a stick
standard
control
aircraft
here.
stick.
The rudders handle the rudder left and right.
Right.
And the stick has a double purpose.
Right. It operates the ailerons to roll the airplane and the elevator to pitch the airplane. Then this cable down here releases the nose hook for the auto and aero towing. And those are all the controls for the pilot.
Do you just pull this cable to release it?
That's right. It just works the Otford link, and it just releases it. Now, an interesting, this glider was set up for bungee launching, and you notice there's another cable back over here. And this one releases the aft tow hook, which is back here under the tail, and that's for bungee launching. In Germany, back in the 1920s, they had lots of kids that could hold the tail down. Well, later, they got it more streamlined, and they just tied the tail to a stake, and the pilot could release the tail himself instead of calling for the launch crew to release the tail on the bungee launches. So this glider is capable of being bungee launched.
If you notice the wind blowing, we're at Tehachapi, the land of the windmills. As a matter of fact, there's about 1,000 windmills right behind us, and they're using all of this wind to generate electricity.
That's correct.
So the same reason that the windmills are here is the reason that you're here with your gliders, because it's a good place to fly?
It's a good place to fly. The wind isn't necessarily what we're looking for. We're looking for actually thermal activity, thermic activity, instability in the air, a super adiabatic lapse rate in the temperatures. where
But
it gets
doesn't the
colder.
wind make a mechanical lift for you?
If it was oriented to the hills right, but you notice our hills are all parallel to the wind.
Oh, I see.
And so really that doesn't help us here in the valley. There's a few ridges
the
back
hills
over
were
here.
built the wrong way.
That's right. So the wind, there's a few hills, one's back up over here, and back over in here we get a little bit of help from the wind. But that's not what our valley is known for. We have thermal soaring here, we have mountain wave soaring here, and something Tehachapi is very famous for, we have a shear line. We notice out here to the west we have Bear Mountain. And what happens is we have two air masses that mix in the valley here. From the north, we get, on the north side of Bear Mountain, the pass where Highway 58 comes through, we get a warm, damp air mass that comes from the irrigated San Joaquin Valley. Over here on the south side, out towards Stallion Springs, we have another pass through the mountains, and we get a cool, dry air mass that started out as moist marine air. However, it has to go over 3 mountain ranges to get here. And each time it goes over a mountain range, it gets lifted, cooled, and the water precipitates out. It goes down. Same thing, and by the time it gets up here, it's a very dry air mass. And as it moves up, we get the adiabatic cooling, and so we have a very cool, dry air mass. And a warm, moist is a very lightweight air mass. A cool, dry is a very dense. And as we get the west winds, which we have today, these two air masses mix around each other. It comes right down the valley, and we have what's called a convergence zone or a shear line.
Now, a shear line, I was taught that if an airplane flies into a shear, it will disintegrate. It can tear it apart. But a glider flying as slow, 20, 25 miles an hour, a glider can penetrate it and not be in danger. Is that true?
Yeah, I think we're talking about two different kinds of shear line. This is just where two air masses mixes. It's called a convergence zone or a shear line. Now, wind shear, that's something else. That's where you have a very, very strong positive wind gradient.
And if you enter a wind shear at a high rate of speed, like an airplane,
that could do some damage. The rotor clouds, especially here in our area, is what we worry about.
But a glider at 20, 25 miles an hour could ease into it.
Right.
Okay, let's go on back with the controls. The wings are covered with fabric. The ailerons are covered with fabric. It doesn't have any flaps because it doesn't need any. This would be called the fuselage.
Right.
The fuselage is open, and actually it looks like an old bridge from the 1920s or 30s.
Almost, or like an old barn door gate.
The bridges of Madison County. That's what
right,
it looks
old
like.
covered bridge, sure.
And going on back to the empennage, the tail, then the vertical stabilizer is covered.
Right, it's just a rudder. There's no vertical stabilizer.
Is covered. Oh,
just
there's
the
no
aft end of the
vertical
fuselage.
stabilizer. Oh, there is no vertical
just the aft end of the fuselage has some fabric.
Okay, the
so
rudder's
it's just the rudder.
There's a horizontal stabilizer.
Right.
There is a horizontal stabilizer.
Right.
It's covered, and the elevator is covered.
Yes.
And everything is hooked together with cables.
Right. It's all wire braced. So it's got the flying wires and the landing wires. These are drag wires here. These are all flying wires back here, and those are anti-drag wires that go back to the tail. These are the landing wires up here.
Now, if you tow this with, I think you use a pickup truck with automatic transmission.
Or stick shift. It's not that important.
Stick shift?
With 1,000 feet of polypropylene rope, there's enough stretch in it to where you can shift, and the stretch will take up the shift, and you won't even know the driver's shifting.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, now I learned something else, because I'd always been told that you had to use automatic transmission.
The old days when they used steel cable or piano wire, I'd say absolutely. But with the
so the type of cable makes the difference?
That makes the difference. Again, there's enough stretch in the polyprop rope that we use.
So the polypropyl rope will allow you to use stick shift?
Easily, yes.
Okay, so you use a truck or a car, auto tow.
We have a pickup truck that we'll use.
And it will lift off at what, 15, 18 miles an hour?
Yeah, about maybe 18 to 20, something like that. We fly at about 35 miles an hour.
And then it goes on tow almost straight up, 45-degree angle?
With the nose hook, we can't quite do that.
That's
it's right on the very nose. If we had it down here at the CG, that's what it would look like. But because it's a nose hook, it's not a very steep climb.
And you can get 900,000 feet?
We have 5,000 feet of runway that we use here, so that gives us enough time to get a good 900 feet, maybe even 1,000 if the wind's right.
And you release at 900 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And what would it cruise at? There's no speedometer, no airspeed indicator.
No, we've put one on here, and 32 to 35 seems to be about where it lies.
If you can't feel,
right?
That's like a stall indicator in an airplane. If you can't feel when an airplane's going to stall, you have no business being
there. You go.
Right.
So about 32 to 35 is where it seems to like it. And then you have to make a decision. Once you launch up, you release, and you've got several decisions to make. If it's low and you have runway left, you'll just land straight ahead. If it looks like you're sinking pretty fast and the wind's not too strong. We don't fly this in very strong winds. You might just do a 180-degree turn and land going back the other direction, the way you came from. Or if you have enough altitude and you're not sinking too fast, you can actually do a little abbreviated pattern with it from that altitude.
Could you sustain in this glider?
We haven't had the luck here yet. We've got some more modifications to do to it. In Europe, last summer in France, a fellow stored one of these just like this for an hour and a half at a vintage meet in France. So we are kind of stuck. We have to fly early in the morning here or late in the evening when the tow planes, the power planes have stopped. And so there's not generally too much thermal activity there, so we've never gotten away on it.
So this is a very basic aircraft where the student goes up on auto tow, releases, and then slowly floats and glides back down to the runway.
Right.
So he's really just getting experience in using the controls and flying the glider.
Just coordinating the hands and feet. That's exactly what this is for.
Okay. Now, since this is not a two-place glider, the instructor can't get in here and teach you how to fly it. How do you qualify to fly this one-place primary?
Well, this glider has a unique feature. It has a post that goes in here and a tripod that you can set it on where it gimbals. So you can put the student. It mounts on a tripod, and you can turn it into the wind, and just the students can wind jam with it. So the instructor's standing right here, just showing you how to work the controls. And then when the student gets good enough at that, they'll go ahead and take it off the tripod and actually tow you down the runway a little bit at a very slow speed where you can't fly. And there's spoilers that bolt on the wings, or that strap onto the wings that you put on so they can't get off the ground. And that just gets them so they can follow the tow vehicle straight. Once
they did that in World War I. The French, who trained the Lafayette Escadrille, they had airplanes
called a Penguin.
Called a Penguin.
Yes.
It was like a Blériot 9 with the wings clipped
Exactly. And there's one of those still exists up in Carson City, a Penguin. Has the original Lawrence engine and everything. So there's actually an operational Penguin in the country.
Okay, so after he's been on the dolly, and after he's gone up and down the taxiway and demonstrated that he or she is able to control the different aspects of it, then you give him an automobile tow?
Yeah, like I say, then they'll go faster and faster. They'll take the spoilers off, and as they get faster, the instructor will have paddles or some kind of device in the car to let the student know that you can rise up a little bit. And then once you stay 3 feet, if you start getting higher, the car will slow down and you'll settle back to the ground. As the student gets better and better, you'll get higher and higher. You eventually start releasing and gliding down. And eventually they're to the point where they can release and fly a circuit around the airport. Now, nobody trains that way anymore, but that's the way they did it. Up until almost 1950, people were doing that. And
my instructor said he would do 20 flights a day.
Yes.
And each flight would be 60 seconds, a minute to a minute and a half, or 2 minutes.
Right.
So they would take a sack lunch and go out and spend the whole
all day. Yeah.
So they used to really do that.
Yeah, and until you could stay up for 5 minutes, they wouldn't even let you put it in the logbook in Germany. So you could have 100 flights in your logbook, but no time logged. So they were very strict, and it was a very unique way of training. Again, and that kind of died out shortly after World War II, that kind of training. Now, these particular gliders were built after World War II, when two-place gliders were common and abundant. The reason these were built was after World War II in England, the military schools were obviously very popular after the war, and all the cadets had something to work with. The Navy cadets had boats to row and boats to sail. The Army cadets had rifles to march with and cannons to polish. Where the Air Cadets didn't have anything. So the Royal Air Force approached the Slingsby Sailplane Works and had them build 150 of these like this for the military schools so the Air Cadets could have something to work with. And the flying wasn't really the important thing at the time. What was important was the teamwork. They actually had it set up so 12 cadets would be in charge of one of these gliders. Each cadet had a job in putting the glider together. These were all de-rigged and rigged every day and put away, and that was all part of the discipline and the teamwork exercise that these were built for.
That's almost like an artillery squad.
It's just exactly. Again, like I say, the Army cadets had the artillery squad. Well, the Air Cadets didn't have anything till this came along. So these were mostly bungee launched on the cricket fields and the soccer grounds of the military schools, the military academies, and that's where all these went. It wasn't until the 70s when these became surplus from the Royal Air Force that glider clubs, people started aero towing them and bungee launching them and auto towing them for the clubs.
I would assume that after the Battle of Britain, that the English were very aware of the importance importance of air power and having young people air-minded.
Absolutely. The English, even before the United States, even before World War II and before the Battle of Britain, were very air-minded. And the government actually lent help when, in the early 1930s, when the British Gliding Association got started. They actually hired some of the German people to come over and give gliding demonstrations in England. And the government...
Wait a minute. Let's say that again for our viewers. The English hired Germans to come over and give glider instruction to the English.
Right, and as you may have heard, what got soaring started pretty much all over the world was a National Geographic article in 1929 that was published or circulated all over the world, and it was about the German glider movement up on the Wasserkuppe. Well, that excited people in the United States and England all over the world. And J.C. Penney, Jr., actually hired some Germans to come over to our country and give gliding demonstrations at Cornhill and Cape Cod.
It's interesting that you should mention that name. When you finish, I'm going to tell you something about J.C. Penney.
Okay. And so anyway, he became one of the founders of soaring in our country. That was J.C. Penney, Jr. And in England, they did the same thing. They actually hired Robert Kronfeld and Wolf Hirt and some of the German gliding pioneers to come over and give demonstrations in England. And the government, the Air Ministry, was favorably impressed enough to actually do some small subsidy of the gliding movement in England back in the early 1930s, before the war clouds were already even starting to show on the horizon. So we were kind of slow in our country with that, but in Europe, all the countries had some government subsidy for the gliding programs for the young people.
I built one of these gliders when I was 14, and I covered the wings and the empennage with J.C. Penney drapery lining.
Ah.
That's why I laughed when you said J.C. Penney.
Uh-huh.
It was a very prominent name in my aviation experience. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell our viewers about this particular primary glider?
Well, this one, it came from England. It was surplus in the 1970s. It came from England. It came to Scott Airport in Lovettsville, Virginia, is where it first came to the country. Came in a container.
Did somebody buy it?
Yes, a fellow named Jan Scott. He's a vintage glider collector on the East Coast. He purchased three of these and one T-21 Sedberg. At that time in the 70s, late 70s, all the British military gliders were being replaced. The wooden gliders were being replaced with composite gliders. So they surplused all of these wooden ones, and so he went over to buy and just bought a whole container full. So three of these and one of the Sedbergs came to this country.
What year was this?
This was probably 1978, 1979.
And they were starting to make gliders out of composite?
Right. They were buying German composite gliders for the Air Cadets programs.
I think the LaBelle was one of the first ones.
That was a very early composite glider. The first one was called the Phoenix. It was built in Germany by the Akaflieg students. And I think there was a dozen of those built. That was developed into the Phoebus glider, a Phoenix glider.
The Diamant, the Phoebus, and the Phoenix are the three that I remember.
Okay, well, the Phoebus was the first. The Diamant and the LaBelle came out about the same time. Very, very early composite gliders. That was in, about 1964, 1965. They started seeing in this country. I saw one of the very first Diamants and LaBelles in '67 that came to this country.
We did a program previously with Bert Rutan, and he told us that the reason he got involved in the very easy and the long easy was because he discovered that they were building gliders with composite, and he said, well, if they can build gliders with composite, they can build airplanes with composite, and that's how he got started.
Right.
And he's a neighbor of yours, just over in Mojave.
Yes, just down the hill from us. His home's just on the other side of these hills, the windmills, in fact.
Very good. Thank you very much for visiting with us today. As always, this is Captain Fred saying, I love airplanes, and I honor the people who fly them. And that includes this primary glider, which holds a very special place in my heart. As always, God bless America, and happy landings.